Welcome back to the Disaster Tough podcast. It's your host, John Scardena. I am so excited for this episode. I met this incredible individual about a year ago, actually, in Orlando for a die pop exercise. If you remember Colonel McKinney, who is now General McKinney, his basically his number two, now retired Lieutenant Colonel Brian Higgins. So big shout out to him. He said, "Hey, you got to meet this incredible guy. He's a former Ranger. He's awesome. He's now the director of the National Center of Urban Operations. It's a think tank based out of New York. Just really the tip of the spear of all things urban warfare, urban operations." And so he's going to talk about that today. Why talking about it during the week of Thanksgiving? First of all, we're big fans of the military, and we always want to say thank you to everything that they do for us. We also really believe in making sure that as we're looking at historical events like the Mumbai terrorist attack or what's happening now, comparing that to now rather with Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, I wanted to talk to an expert. I want to say, hey, what's going on over there? What is the emergency management perspective? But I also want to make sure that we are protecting civilian populations and protecting people who are not, combatants. So with that being said, I would like the great pleasure of introducing Chris onto the podcast. Chris, thanks for joining me today.
John, how's it going? You're a great hype man, by the way. I got motivated just listening to you.
You know what? Like I said, I have this mannequin behind me. I think I'm going to name him Chris because of the, amazing Chris physique. So we're doing that. But, let's go back to a year ago at Die Pop. You're a military guy. You've been military your whole career. You're now leading this amazing think tank, and I want to talk about that for a second. In terms of walking into this conversation where we have this kind of a mixed bag of military, first responders, emergency managers dealing with an attack on a stadium, what was your perspective maybe before you went in there, and what were kind of the takeaways? Not about the training per se, but comparing civilian side to military side?
No, that's a great question, John. And I think it's a great way to kind of frame the discussion today because so much of the urban problem set is so complex that it can't be handled by just the military or just emergency managers. I came into that not knowing what to expect. I had very rudimentary understanding of what an emergency manager does. But as a professional in our craft, in our space, we always seek more learning, which is one of the themes I'll hit on throughout this. So seeing how you guys built this crisis that everybody had to coalesce around and immediately start applying their professional tools was incredibly insightful. I think I said towards the end of it, I spent most of my career on the other side of the house, i.e. I was the element causing crises on other people.
It's pretty fun.
So to see like how crisis management took place, from an emergency manager's perspective was incredibly eye-opening. And I thought it was an excellent exercise overall.
I appreciate that. We really want to make sure that, there's so many components to try to do this right. There's stopping the bad guy, which is kind of your side of the house. But, things happen. Murphy's Law is real. Things slip, things happen. So if there was a terrorist attack again in the United States, who are all the parties? And, you can't have a great exercise if you don't have military, first responders, the emergency management coordination, all those pieces to come together. What I like most about that training is that, it forces people to take responsibility without having legal authority. So many times, like people fall back on my side, like, oh, I have to operate within this box. But that box kind of implodes when big things happen.
That's right.
And they have to be able to think outside the box, which is basically your entire career of like thinking outside the box and understanding those components. So that being said, and I appreciate that because I was just hyper curious in the beginning. Wouldn't it be appropriate to talk without really understanding your history and really what you're doing there as the director of the National Center of Urban Operations? Can you kind of explain like your perspective and what you guys are trying to do over there?
Sure, 100%. Just a quick overview of my background. So I just recently retired out of the Army as a infantry officer, lieutenant colonel. Spent 20 years between the Ranger Regiment, Asymmetric Warfare Group, a bunch of deployments overseas, and I think I everybody on our team has some kind of scar tissue related to operating in an urban environment where we felt either A, a little less than prepared, or B, the mission was incredibly difficult just due to the scale of it. So, when we all retired, we all wanted to continue to help the military drive forward on training, education, and concepts when it came to urban operations. So one of our co-founders, Colonel retired Patrick Mahaney, retired Special Forces officer, Brooklyn native. I think you've met him at some event. I can't remember exactly.
I think it was Philadelphia. I met him.
Yeah, he's familiar with all your guys' work. He loves it, by the way. And he basically started the National Center for Urban Operations there in New York City to be essentially a community of practice between public safety professionals and then national security professionals.
Awesome.
As we work to keep urban areas safer, specifically in the United States. I mean, obviously, when you go to New York City, you see what happened during 9/11, and then you see the power of the interagency and how they all come together to try to prevent another 9/11. So it's a great place to work.
Real quick, we're going to pause for this week's Disaster Tough endorsements. The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapsed and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today. If you served in the military, you've probably worn Proper Apparel. Proper Apparel is now reaching out to first responders and those who love the outdoors. Check out Proper Apparel, from the outdoors to the EOC, wear proper. Okay, let's jump back in.
I don't know if it's just getting older, and so like I feel like I have more situational awareness of what's always been happening in the world, but it does feel like things are getting more progressively more dangerous on basically every front. And what is fascinating to me is like turning on the news and the pundits like casually talking about World War III, of like, oh, this might happen, like. You're like, I don't feel like this should be a casual conversation, and yet it's the world we live in. Let's fast forward to like both Ukraine and Gaza and the spillover effect. From your perspective, especially from that urban warfare, it feels like all war, in at least in the modern age, will be not fought on open fields, but in urban centers. How do we? I don't even know how. I don't want to be nonchalant in this like the pundits do, but how do we even like get ready for something like that, where it's like, okay, these mega cities like Dubai or Mumbai or the New York cities of the world, Houston's. It feels like there's so much to be learned, and yet the history of war is maybe very different than what the future of war will be. I don't know. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is the problem set that we deal with day in, day out at the National Center for Urban Operations. The world's not getting any less urbanized, and because of that, wars are fought where people are. It's an unavoidable future. The conflicts are going to get more and more urban, and the old doctrine of either bypassing or isolating and then doing pinpoint rates. Some of that still holds true, but when you don't have a choice, like what we're seeing in real time in Gaza City, where you have to go in, it makes this incredibly complex operating environment very, very difficult. Kind of going to some of your points about the media, I'm going to cover real quick what we talk about is like the 5 eyes at the National Center for Urban Operations. And again, shout out to Lieutenant Colonel Brian Higgins. I think he wrote it on the back of a bar napkin, and he was like, what do you think about this? And I was like, man, knocked it out of the park again. Take something so complex and simplify it to a way that's understandable to people that aren't practitioners, right? So the 5 eyes we refer to as, number 1 is infrastructure, right? The density of the infrastructure, superstructure above ground, substructure below ground, and then just the density of buildings at surface level. The second eye is interagency. And the reason why we put that in there is we have seen that in various exercises or real life events, interagency coordination that is good helps drive faster solutions. But if there's a lack of interagency coordination, then it becomes Yeah, exactly. Thumbs down, right? It goes the total opposite
Crapshoot.
direction.
Yeah.
Hand in hand with the interagency piece is the interoperability. So the interoperability that goes from, okay, what is our civilian policies versus our military policies? Even going down to like radios. How do we talk to each other if we have different nets, right? So interoperability is something to think about.
Yeah.
The fourth I is information. And this kind of gets to the media piece you mentioned before, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, there's so much going on in the world, and the speed of information travels so fast that everything can be sensationalized. And I think one thing we saw early in Ukraine was that, the power of the narrative, I think, really inspired a lot of people in Ukraine to believe, yes, we can stand up for ourselves and fight the Russians. And the power of the narrative also inspired a lot of the international community to back the Ukrainians as well. So information is incredibly powerful. From a micro level, you have to understand how information is playing in your backyard or in your area of operations. You're working in an urban environment. So if you have a blind spot and you're not aware that, protesters are doing this or the locals are upset about that, like you may have gone into that urban area with a certain goal, but they have, as the locals who live there, they have their own lives, their own goals, and their own daily flow of life that they're trying to do. So that may impede what your overall, goal was to begin with, to why you're there. So the information is that is really the future. Dr. Russ Blaine, he has a great line in one of his books. The book is called "Come Hell or High Fever," and in there he talks about information. And one of the lines he says is, if the pen is mightier than the sword, then the printing press is the equivalent to standing armies, and social media can have the capability of a nuclear weapon, which is totally true, right? So you can see how fast somebody with a cell phone standing on a corner filming a certain event can absolutely change the world, right? Because social media, it catches fire. So how do you deal with all this complexity and where, the infrastructure, the people, and now I got other people I got to work with for solutions. And that's where the fifth I comes in, and that's really innovation. So having an innovative mindset of how do we approach this problem from maybe a different angle? How do we think outside the box? How do we take what works from our doctrine, but maybe tweak it a little bit for this particular urban environment? So the 5 I's is really a good way for us to kind of break down the complexity of the problem set and then how can we arrive at a solution. So
that's really phenomenal. Infrastructure, interagency, interoperability, information, innovation.
That's it.
Love it. Next week, the Readiness Lab is going to come out with this new idea of 5 I's for emergency management. Now, it's that's really honestly that we might have just found our title for the episode, the 5 I's of, urban operations. But
oh man, you would make again one Brian Higgins very happy man if you saw that.
The 5 B's of Brian. Guy's a cool guy, and really, it's really fascinating to me, speaking of him and now General McKinney, and you, when I see military professionals who are willing to work with civilian populations, I get a lot of hope for the future of protecting people, because a lot of the first responder perspective is unfortunately very micro. They've responded to, I don't want to minimize their experiences, but domestic incidents, stopping cars, that kind of stuff on such a small scale. They don't really understand big scale. And military is all about, how do you do tactical operations to affect big change? And I really want to get emergency managers and really the emergency services field to capture that thought of there's all these individual missions that are happening. Now, my missions are like sheltering operations, search and rescue, gathering or evacuating populations. Like those are each individual mission sets. And yet, if you fail on any of those mission sets, you fail overall. You have to get people out of disaster. You have to get them safe. You have to keep them safe against future incidents, and you have to feed them. You have to do all these things, let alone the other side of the house, which is we don't want those things to come here. Right? And so I'm just going to break this down. I'm using your 5 I's, if you will. I'm hoping to shift the conversation. Can we talk about the 5 I's individually from maybe what's happening in Gaza? Because I kind of prefaced this episode, right? Like, I'm on the Israel side. Like you attack, a music festival, and this part's kind of sensitive for the audience, but if you rape and drag bodies of females in the streets cheering, I'm all in for taking you out. And they built these tunnel systems specifically under hospitals and schools, right?
Right.
Like they're using civilian populations to do that. So in terms from an infrastructure perspective, can you help myself and the audience kind of understand the problem set that Israel has to deal with? I mean, we kind of mentioned the tunnels, but if you could kind of help us understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we go into the five eyes for that particular problem set, I think what you mentioned before is kind of a key point that everybody who's listening should probably think about and consider from their particular job, right? Well, they're foxholes, we say in the military. And that's this idea of strategic compression, right? So a tactical event or a very tactical job that you may have to do, if it goes wrong, it can have strategic impacts, right? The cascading effects of, okay, well, we weren't able to handle the evacuation effectively, and now we have a bigger problem because more people are contaminated, like we did in the Dine Pop exercise, right?
Yeah.
That concept, it really comes from the idea of what we have called the strategic corporal, which was mentioned by a former Marine Corps General Krulak. And the strategic corporal was somebody who was on the ground in the middle of an urban fight, and they did something that immediately has strategic impacts to, what was now being told to U.S. forces, operating in a place like, say, Fallujah, right?
Right.
So this concept, strategic corporal, it's a good example of what strategic compression is, and that strategic compression really is driven a lot of times, like we mentioned before, by the interconnected nature of the world with cell phones and social media and things like that. So strategic compression is something to always think about. Like, you may think that you're like low man on the totem pole and you have a small job, but if it doesn't go well, it could have cascading effects, both positive and negative, right? Depending how good you do your particular job.
Yeah.
So everybody does have to be kind of like a professional in their particular job and know it in and out and be dynamic in their thinking. But to get to your question about the current Five Eyes, if we were to break down what's going on in Gaza, the infrastructure is the obvious hard problem right now, with the amount of subterranean facilities and tunnels and everything else underneath Gaza City. That is what we call a asymmetric capability, right? So an asymmetric capability is essentially a low cost, high impact capability that typically a weaker force will use against a stronger military. So examples of asymmetric capabilities that we're familiar with are like the IEDs, right? So when I was in the invasion of Iraq, 2003, we're rolling around Baghdad for the first half of it, in just like no armor on our Humvees, right? And then all of a sudden in like December 2003, IEDs started coming out of nowhere and they just started blowing everybody up. That drove, complete changes into like the kind of vehicles we were getting from the defense industry and changes in tactics and everything else. So that was and these IEDs were cheap, right? Cheaply made.
Yeah.
And they killed and maimed a bunch of soldiers, right? And they really disrupted operations. That's a classic asymmetric capability. Asymmetric capabilities we're seeing play out today, both in Ukraine and places like Azerbaijan and Armenia, and then in Israel is the small UAS, right? We even saw them in Mosul when ISIS was using these, right? And these were small, commercial off-the-shelf drones, which UAS for the group is, we call that unmanned aerial systems in the military, but it's these small commercial off-the-shelf drones like DJIs that are bought from China for like $1,200 a pop, and they were weaponizing them, right? They were putting hand grenades on them, explosives on them, and that's a cheap, reproducible capability that can negate, a multi-million-dollar tank, right? If you drop this explosive into the hatch of a tank and kill the group, you've negated that capability, right? So that's another asymmetric capability. The one that the IDF are dealing with right now is this subterranean fight. And just for the good of the group, we in the military break down subterranean into three kind of categories. Category one is very rudimentary tunnels, things that you may see like crossing the border between us and Mexico. There was a bunch of rudimentary tunnels between Gaza and Israel. These are quickly made. They can be very deep. Sometimes they have some infrastructure to it, like lighting and airflow and things like that, but small, for movement, right? That's category one. Category two is like the civilian infrastructure you would see in any major city around the world. So subway systems, big utility tunnels, things like that, sewer systems. Those are all category two subterranean facilities.
Yeah.
Category three is purpose-made, military purpose-made subterranean facilities. So think about all the various underground facilities in North Korea, right? Where they have all their indirect fire platforms, they have artillery, they have, full sail bases in there. So that's a category three. So in Gaza, which is a very small piece of land, especially Gaza City, you have all three of those kinds of subterranean facilities all underground, right? And Hamas is using that as an asymmetric defense, right? So like it essentially takes away the strength of the IDF's ability to execute combined arms. So combined arms is when you have like ground assault with like air power and artillery. Once you go underground and into a tunnel, it's like me and you face to face in a lot of these situations, right? So it makes it extremely difficult to operate in. So that's like the infrastructure side of the house.
Can you ever trust people if they were mixed in a population before that created Hamas? I don't know. I don't know. I'm just saying that loud.
No, that's a good question. Everybody has to be in the information game, right? And trust me, there's a million smarter people than I am when it comes to countering ideological, concepts and things like that. But the problem is we all have to get involved, right? Because everybody has the power in the palm of their hand to push out a narrative, to push out a positive ideological concept, to, thumbs down a negative, ideological concept that may come across your feed on like Reddit, so everybody's got to kind of be involved, and they have to like do their best to figure out what's truth versus what's a narrative, right? But that's kind of like, those of us that live in a modern society, that's our frame of thinking. Terrorists and the breeding grounds for terrorism, they don't really care about all that, right? Like, they have a much different viewpoint of the world, and one that's, a lot of times embedded in a religious background, right? And because of that, like, we're kind of trying to counter, an extremist religious viewpoint that has been instilled in them from birth with like, hey, well, common sense Western world says that this is the way it should be, right? So I think the first step is we got to recognize that there's a huge gap there in the way that, terrorists view information versus how we do. And then how do you close that gap? And I think it's not anything, there's no silver bullet to that, right? It's got to be something that a lot of times is pushed over time. It's got to be pushed by, fellow, people from the same background to say like, hey, what you're thinking is not correct. But one thing I do want to kind of go back that we were talking about, what about the risk here in the States? We do have the power of the interagency here, right? Which is why that's what our fight lies. So getting people talking to one another and understanding each other and building bonds across the interagency before a crisis, it's one of the huge takeaways that could help us either prevent, terrorist attacks, lone wolf attacks, crisis in general. And if we can't prevent it, at least immediately respond forcefully to try to, get things back to the status quo. So,
not to make light of the situation, but there's an episode of Family Guy where Peter was in jail and he gets out of jail right before somebody tries to give him the shiv. And this guy's sitting alone in the jail cell and he's like looking at this shiv and he like pokes himself with it. He's like, is this what I've been doing to people? I deserve to be here. Maybe we just need to have everybody listen to Disaster Tough and like, they'll realize. But speaking of the interagency component and kind of reflecting based off of, when we met a year ago and then we saw each other in Nashville for the DUT, which was awesome, by the way. So big shout out to everyone in Nashville who was working in that. The interagency component, explain to me, and I think I understand the concept, but explain the difference between interagency and interoperability.
Yeah, so interagency is very much a term that we use within federal circles, Department of Defense circles. It's how do we work across our existing federal, state, local, municipal entities, right? Because we all have our own chains of command, and we all have our own authorities and our own budgets and our own capabilities. And if you don't work from an interagency perspective, you end up with these like stovepipes of success, right? It's like, man, this local agency did excellent in responding, but they could have done a little better if they actually would have, leveraged something from a sister agency, right? So that's the interagency concept. Interoperability a lot of times gets to actual, like what capabilities, like what radios are we using, like, what weapon systems are we using, what, communication device, all those kinds of things. And also what planning, and this is the bigger thing I think is more important, is like what planning processes do we use? So a planning process for a military person is going to be different than a planning process for like a professional firefighting, the FDNY or something like that, right? So, planning processes is where a lot of the interoperability needs to come together, because you could have the interagency all together in the same room, but if they can't talk because they can't get past their own organizational language, then you have an interoperability problem.
Hey, we're going to do a quick pause X to thank our sponsors, L3 Harris, Proper Apparel, Impulse, Doberman Emergency Management, and all those subscribers who reach out to us and give us a donation to help us keep us going. Let's jump back in.
Case in point, 9/11. A helicopter, I think it was a police helicopter, I think it was a police helicopter, couldn't inform the firefighters on the ground.
That's right.
That were in the other building And so you fast forward to today, that is a problem set that I am constantly aware of and at this point very sick of. In every single after action report, like the number one thing that comes out of it is like communications issues, both from the interagency perspective and from the interoperability perspective, through equipment use, through language, through getting along, whatever, through known relationships prior to all the way through people operating in the same disaster at the same time, having no idea that the other person's been operating under there. I was just at the National Urban Search and Rescue Conference talking about a big operation where we evacuated 30,000 people out of, I think it was like north of Corpus Christi in Hurricane Harvey. And somebody came up to me afterwards and said, that didn't happen, you weren't there. And I was like, I was literally there. There's pictures of me. I was there. And they were so convinced in their little bubble in Texas where they were operating, I think it was out of Houston, they had no idea of this other thing. And so it's like, man, like the guy was just like the case in point of we need to overcome both these issues. That was just, it's just wild to me that that's even a thing, right? But that being said, obviously I'm pretty pissed about it still, but that's fine. Getting back to like the interoperability component, military versus civilian. In terms of Gaza, I deeply understand the humanitarian aspect of people who, for myriad of reasons, 100 different reasons, couldn't either fight back from the political leadership at the time, which was Hamas for several years, or currently now feeling that they're stuck because they can't get out. And so I want to help those people. I see those kids. I hear those stories, that narrative that's being shared. You look at the data and you want peace, right, in Gaza, 100%, absolutely. At the same time, I'm pro-Israel. I what happened there is difficult. From the interoperability component, whether it's Gaza or beyond, how does the military balance? We've been doing this now for 20 years, right? Because of what's been happening in the Middle East, and the U.S. is previously what we were, trying to accomplish there. You're always going to have a civilian population. That civilian population doesn't seem to leave, right?
Right.
How do you balance humanitarian interoperability with military objectives?
So that's some of the power of information. I mean, I think the IDF has done a pretty good job of broadcasting a lot of what they're doing to try to minimize some of the civilian population, civilian casualties. At the end of the day, it's also, they're in a full-blown war, right? And there is civilian casualties, unfortunately, in war. And I think it's a uncomfortable truth that a lot of people who have never been in a war don't realize, right? Of course, we all would like peace and love throughout the world, and we all would like, suffering to stop. But an uncomfortable truth of war is that, people die.
Yes.
And, in dense urban environments, it makes limiting civilian casualties that much more difficult when an adversary is literally having exits to their tunnel system into schools or hospitals. And it's very deliberate that they're doing that, right? That's part of the asymmetric advantage they're trying to gain. Because they're hoping that, somewhere along the way, there's going to be a mistake. And that's one of the challenges I think the IDF faces is, the concept of time. The longer this goes on, the more there is a risk that something may happen or a narrative is pushed that completely changes the dynamic of the environment with that strategic compression we talked about previously. So time is not on the side of an attacker in an urban environment, because it could make increased chances for, civilian casualties.
That's that kind of, if you look at Ukraine, that narrative in the beginning of people staying, and John Spencer, who was on the podcast, talked about that, of like the numbers you need to attack an urban center. If you have a population who stays, exponentially over time, it just becomes more and more difficult. And that is exactly where we're at right now with Ukraine. I think everybody thought Ukraine was going to fall in half a second, and it's basically a forever war at this point. And that narrative, man, they've been fighting that for a while now. Whether you agree with what they're doing or not what they're doing, it's that narrative piece comes into a play of, do they still have an opportunity? The time piece, fighting uncomfortable truths, the uncomfortable truths that I always have to push people to realize, on the natural hazard side, even the natural hazard side is people die in disasters. That's why it's called a disaster. If your home's impacted, guess what? It's going to be 10 years before you're back in that home. That's the reality, right? Great friend of mine lost his home in Hurricane Ian, I think it was. And that was 2 years ago. And he said, hey, it's going to be another 2 years, right, before he's fired. I think actually it might have been a year ago. But he said it'll be another 2 years before they have, any kind of structure that's sound. Things take time. The problem set of information is that information's instantaneous, but solutions are not.
That's right.
And so people get so impatient, and we can both, I think, appreciate is, the uncomfortable truth of get over it. Things take time. If you want to do things and you do things right, they have to take time. And yet, I don't want anybody to be able to be impacted, but I also don't want terrorists to ever exist ever again. So
that's right. Yeah,
it's a tough time.
Like I said, the terrorism thing is not going away. Ideologies like that, I mean, they can last for centuries, right? So you see it. I had a buddy of mine. He was one of the last commanders in Afghanistan, and I was asking about the fighting of ISIS over there and everything else, and he's like, if there's one thing the enemy doesn't have, it's a fourth generation problem, because we've been at this for 20 years and there's no shortage of enemy, right? So that's just kind of highlights the power of an ideology and how it can really drive persistent conflict and terrorism. So,
which drives the last point of what you're doing right now is innovation, right? We got to do things differently. The Readiness Lab, that lab part of Readiness Lab is really harping or foot stomping that innovation piece. I need to get better on my side of the house. I'm so sick of the stupid mistakes that have gotten people hurt, the responders or the civilians, and these large-scale disasters. I think we could be exponentially better with better information and better interoperability and better interagency and the whole thing. Even better infrastructure. We have aging infrastructure that impacts, everything that we're trying to operate under. And yet that doesn't even address all the information problem. We have a lot of issues that the issues are the same. The problem sets are very different.
Right.
If that makes any sense. So in terms of the innovation piece of either what Gaza needs to address or urban warfare in the future, besides coming onto an emergency management podcast, which I thoroughly appreciate because I'm asking you super basic questions that I'm just curious about, which I'm sure you're like, dude, I could talk about this, ad nauseum. But what do we need to do in order to innovate to the next level to save and protect lives in an urban environment?
No, that's a great question. And we always teach in our courses up in New York City when we have various units coming up that it starts with the right mindset, right? Having that innovative mindset of, okay, now I'm going to just due to a problem of scale, of just the density, complexity, and intensity of an urban environment, how can I drive solutions that will meet the outcomes I'm looking for? So it starts with the mindset. But the other thing that I think that is important for everybody to understand is that you can't come in and just do like a wholesale change on something, right? So you have to also be a professional and understand your profession. Because once you kind of have a deep understanding of your job and your profession, it'll almost be like a light bulb where you recognize the capability gaps that exist, right? And it's like, oh, I've been doing this for like 5 years and this consistently is a problem in my job. Now that's where I want to apply that innovative mindset to find a solution, right? So you got to definitely know your job, be a professional in your job, and then identify what those consistent problems and gaps are and start trying to drive towards an innovative solution towards it. One thing that I thought was interesting when I was at the Asymmetric Warfare Group is we did a study on how much of our innovative solutions were material in nature. So i.e. I buy something commercial off the shelf, we 3D print a new capability versus non-material. And it came out to like 83% of our innovative solutions were non-material, right? It was a change in our processes or a change in how we did business, or it was bringing different people from different organizations into a small, like cross-functional team, right? So we had all these non-material solutions that didn't really cost any money. They just required a change in thinkings and a willingness to deviate from your existing processes, right? Which that's the hiccup. I think you said it before. It's like, I've got my processes. I'm going to do my process because that's what my job requires.
Yep.
You got to get out of that mindset. You have to have the innovative mindset of like, okay, I understand the process. And because of that, I feel comfortable deviating from the process to find an innovative solution.
What about the problem of, or rather, let me rephrase this. You just explained my entire field within 30 seconds because
you did a great job in Orlando. I mean, I love you about 3 days.
I'm a good teacher. No, the problem with innovation in emergency services and emergency management is that, ironically, in my field, the reason why emergency management really kicked off was for better mitigation and response project management, really.
Right.
If you really look at the history, it was for response. Let's not have response happen, but if it happens, we wanted to get better at doing response. And you had a lot of people who retired out of the response job who wanted to write a brick on a shelf that nobody was ever going to read. And, cushion job. And somehow, we had to go back to our roots, which is the weirdest way to innovate, right? Like, hey, you forgot the original reason why we were all here in the first place, which is kind of my whole shtick on Disaster Tough. I want emergency managers to learn from people in adjacent fields, see what leadership's like, and to apply, right? If that happens, it's the win, right? That's the whole information sharing, my whole cultural warfare that I'm trying to do in the same piece. At the same time, the military, at least from my outside perspective, and Zach's my number 2 in the company, and I have the opportunity to work with a lot of military personnel, and excited for that. It seems that the military, when there's a problem set like IEDs popping up, okay, we're going to put armor on trucks, we're going to change tactics, we're going to put in new policies, we're going to try to get, make this safer. Emergency managers, it's like if you start talking about data science or using, better processes, it's like, but wait, what about my brick on a shelf? You're like,
right.
Plans are great, but your plans actually kind of suck because you're not using any of the other stuff, any of the tools available. My last question for you, and we've been talking for a while, and I'm really grateful for your time here, is if you're going to address innovation and you have to be professional and you have to understand where you can innovate, if my big problem set is that willingness to innovate outside of something stupid happening and therefore the forcing to innovate, how do you how are you a positive force of change and innovation?
That's a great question. And I think the way I look at it as, and this is what I would tell my junior officers, is you want to make your corner of the Army as best as you can. Like the big Army machine may have problems, but if you are focused on your little corner of the Army and doing the absolute best you can, then you'll be all right. So how do you do that, right? And I think it really comes to exercising innovation. Like exercise a real world event, even if it's small and even if it's just your little team. You look at, okay, if there was a disaster, what would we do? What would our response be, right? And if every leader kind of starts like legitimately planning exercises throughout, an entire calendar year, not just once and then, hey, we're doing this to certify that we're good to go on the eyes of whoever's looking at us. And it's like, no, like let's actually embrace the hardest parts of our craft, the hardest parts of our job, and let's drill this consistently, right? Like you don't want the first time where you're dealing with shared hardship when an actual real life shared hardship occurs, right? So build in mentally challenging tabletop exercises into like your weekly or bi-weekly events. It doesn't have to be a big production a lot of times. It could be like, hey, we're going to get around a whiteboard and we're going to talk this for 3 hours. And here's the scenario, right? Now let's look at what the solutions, what are some of our assumptions we may have? And then, what are some innovative problems? So, I think exercise is the takeaway for leaders at all levels, all the way up to like, a governor's staff, down to what somebody who may be an incident commander at some point. They got to really look at how can I do exercises routinely to where everybody in my team has a good understanding of what's expected of us.
Yeah, those exercises can be tabletop exercises, as you called out. It can be functional. You could be, I like the idea of shared hardship. Like, I like to call it getting in the mud with people. If I haven't been in the mud with you, I don't want to do that for the first time in a disaster. That's because I don't know how you operate under high stress. And you know how I operate under high stress. When I am in really high stress situations, my humor comes out and it's super dark, and there's no filter left. Yeah, but it's how I deal with the stress, right? If somebody's like stressing out and they have a lot of anxiety and they don't want to like laugh, and I'm over there like making a joke about, the dead people or whatever, that might not go over well, right? And vice versa, if their level of stress. And so we want to become more professional, both as a group and as an individuals, and like recognize all those different situations where we can operate as a team. I'm going to give myself a pretty big tip of the hat here, because the Readiness Lab came out with a paid subscription called the Insider Program. It's basically a membership. And the team has several things that happen every single month. We come out with our own tabletop exercises. And so if people are struggling to come up with like scenarios, because one, they haven't been in a real disaster before, or they're just not a creative person, we're like literally giving them new scenarios with audio and visual, the whole deal that they can check into. We have live webinars. We have our own podcasters forum. I think Pete Gaynor, former head of FEMA, is going to be with us in December. Like, we're trying to help the field, but we're not enough. Like, that's one aspect, but people do need to build it into their normal routines. One of the things, and I'm going to call out FEMA here for a second, one of the things that was frustrating to me on the national strike team that I'm at West, we had a lot of blue sky time, but we didn't do a lot of exercises. Why wasn't that a thing? Now, we had some, and we had a really great team, but I think people, once they get good, they think, all right, now I'm good, now I can focus on other stuff. But you can't lose that competitive edge. You have to keep exercising. It has to become normalized across the board. So great call out there.
Yeah, and one final thing too, you mentioned before about how the Army iterates rapidly, and rapidly in quotes for those of you listening, on how fast the Army iterates on solutions
compared to us. Yeah, it's lightning speed. Yeah,
but I think that the frame of mind that everybody in the military has in a combat zone is that manpower is a finite resource, right? So you don't have a choice, right? If soldiers are dying, you absolutely need to figure out a way to change that immediately, right?
Yeah.
And then still accomplish your mission and still, be successful in whatever mission you were given. So that mindset of, hey, it's happening to us, our guys. I think there may be something there that may be worth exploring, because emergency managers in general are responding to a population that's dying, a population that's undergoing a hardship, right?
Sure.
Versus fellow emergency management team people, in some cases.
No way. Yeah.
I mean, and I'm thinking more of like from like the emergency management cells and operational centers and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there needs to be a frame of mind of anybody who's in the emergency management business is like, my actions or inactions or in my, dedication to planning and preparation will directly impact somebody's life, right? Live or die.
Yes.
So having the right mindset of like what I do matters. And if I don't do it well, or if I'm slow, it could have negative impacts on somebody else's life, is something that is just inherently driven into us in the military, right?
Yeah.
So that's there may be something there that's worth exploring, just the mindset of an emergency manager versus the mindset of like a military leader.
Yeah, we could probably, man. Okay, I'm writing that one down because my brain is already thinking about the whole thing of taking responsibility. There's a whole lack of that, and there's a whole lack of understanding what your role is, because we haven't really defined well historically what emergency managers are supposed to do. Are they the retired guy that wants an easy job, or are they a guy or girl who had a tactical job and now they're excellent at the strategic job because they understand the tactical? That's very different. It could be the exact same person, but their mindset completely changes the game. And until we figure that out as a field, the people who hire us, whether you're working for a Fortune 500 company, a stadium, or the government, if they don't know what we're supposed to do, what our standard mindset is, then why should they give us funding? Why should they give us opportunities? Why should they pay for all that training or exercises when we don't have the mindset of the decisions I make today will save or not save somebody's life down the line? And I think that's a great call out. Chris, seriously, it's more than a pleasure to talk to you. I wanted you to have you back on. Yeah. I have about 100 more questions I want to ask you about urban centers and working in urban centers. Thank you for helping us understand the complexity of what they're dealing with right now in Gaza and what Israel has to deal with that. From the podcasting perspective, everybody who's listening in, again, I'm pro-Israel. However, we definitely want war to end. We hope that people like Chris and his team, and as they go through the 5 I's, the infrastructure, interagency, interoperability, information, and innovation of dealing with urban warfare, that they can address those things to be able to save lives faster. And I really hope the best for Chris and his team and for all those who are trying to stop war from happening. So, with that big call out. Sorry.
No. Yeah. And I just want to throw this out to everybody as well. So thanks to you and your team for, having us on, and to anybody who's listening. I mean, obviously if they're listening to your podcast, they're trying to do the right thing as it is, right?
Sure.
So when we talk about, things that everybody can do better, that I think that comes from a place of understanding that everybody is working hard in a very difficult field. But it does require, everybody trying to up their game a little bit more each day. So thanks for having me on as well. It was been a great discussion.
Sure. All right. So if you like this podcast, if you're thinking about urban warfare, if you're thinking about the emergency management perspective, if you've been watching what's happening in Gaza or Ukraine and wondering what you would do with civilian populations if we were hit by terrorists or otherwise, how do you save and sustain life? It might not be a terrorist. It might be an earthquake that takes out the entire West Coast. How do you deal with tens of millions of people who have to have their lives saved and sustained? If you're thinking about those kind of questions, we would love to see that in the comments below. We want to thank, again, Director Chris D. Ruyter from the National Center of Urban Operations. That think tank in New York is doing amazing things. If you're in the military and this is kind of an angle that you have been focusing on and that you want to learn more about, make sure you check out what they're doing. Chris, thanks again so much for coming onto the podcast and talking with me. And we really hope that you and your team, again, can just do wonderful things to help the U.S. military move the mission forward. So thanks again.
Appreciate it, John. Good times.
All right. So, with that being said, if you like this episode, give us a 5-star rating, subscribe, and we'll see you for next week. Thanks.
Hello, this is John Scardena, the founder of the Readiness Lab. I'm a big fan of George Siegel. George Siegel is a documentary filmmaker who's creating a new film called Built to Last, Buyer Beware. He is making a film that will help you and others learn how to protect your home against any incident. For those who've responded to lots of disasters like we have, we understand how critically important it is to protect your home against builders, insurance, incidents, what name you. This documentary, Built to Last, Buyer Beware by George Siegel, is a great way to learn about this. You can support this cause and learn more about how you can protect your own home by donating to the film's cost. To learn more about this fundraiser, go to movetheworldfilms.org.